And also throughout 2019, as Dirk knows very well, and all the colleagues of Water Europe, the Commission has been relentless. We finalized an impressive fitness check on the Water Framework Directive and related acquis, Floods Directive included, which I think lays down the basis for having an ambitious new EU climate adaptation strategy, which is also in the making, and which has identified that there are some challenges when using the Water Framework Directive that relate to the fact that this directive has been so far slowly implemented. In principle, member states should have achieved good status of both surface and groundwater back in 2015. We are already in 2020, and this is still not the case. We know that the ultimate deadline is 2027, and still 40% only of our surface water are in good status. We have issues related to the integration of the water acquis into other policy areas, agriculture, transport, energy, industrial production. Problems related to chemicals pollution that need to be better tackled, problems related to making better use of digitalization, plenty of, I would say, juicy food ahead on which we would like to interact and work with all the stakeholders to get this crucial challenge right. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you so much for your enthusiasm. I really appreciate what you and the team are doing in the European Commission, and adding that very much to the vision of President von der Leyen's Commission around the European Green Deal. I think that I can't help constantly repeating myself, in particular in international fora, but I think the leadership of the European Commission and Europe at this very important time when we're looking at these crisis moments is fundamental. I don't know if Esther has been able to join us at this time.
Yes, I think so, Sandrine, sorry.
Fabulous. Hi, Esther.
Hi.
What is your perspective around the Water Framework Directive coming from the NGO and civil society view?
Thank you very much, and hi, everyone. Sorry for the hiccup. I mean, first, I think I don't need to convince this audience about how water is essential, for human life, but also it's a fundamental resource for nature and for economies. And there are many sectors represented today that need water to operate and need nature also to thrive. And Mrs. Manfredi has referred to the unhealthy status of EU fresh waters as well. And yet the situation has slightly improved over the last 2 decades, thanks to the Water Framework Directive, but it's true that the progress is still too slow. And globally, the situation is still worse because freshwater species have declined by 83%. So the message here is, I agree, it's crucial that, civil society organizations, businesses, decision makers, we really work together to safeguard rivers and lakes. And the biodiversity strategy that was published by the Commission really stressed that private investments are vital also to achieve the commitments to protecting and restoring our ecosystems, including freshwater ecosystems. So we look forward to seeing business investing in nature. On the directive, well, I think the roundtable today is so timely. And first of all, I would really like to congratulate the Commission for standing by the evidence and really giving the final sign-off to the fitness check. It's been said many times, but I think it's worth repeating really that the WFD is one of the most ambitious and holistic pieces of EU environmental legislation. And yesterday with the announcement of Commissioner Sinkevičius, I think it's important that we know that now what we really need to do is fast-track implementation. That's really what now we are asking to the Commission. It's clear that there are no excuses for further delays from member states. And as Mrs. Manfredi has said, I think now is the role of all of us to work with all the stakeholders to ensure that, as I said, we fast-track implementation and we ensure that the WFD objectives are met by 2027. And that for me is also a sign that the Commission is standing by the strong evidence, is taking into account the views of hundreds of thousands of citizens, businesses and scientists that participated in the fitness check. But also, I think the most importantly, politically, is following up on the ambitions on the European Green Deal and the biodiversity strategy. I could say that maybe I can refer later to how we can address the implementation gaps. I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So very briefly,
shall we go into when we get more specifically into the questions?
Yes. Okay.
That would be super. Thank you so much, Esther. And I couldn't agree with you more that really the WFD is incredibly ambitious. And again, the European Union should be really proud of what it's done in the area of water. And I think what's really fascinating by this group and also the discussions that we're seeing across stakeholders is the incredible belief also from the business community that we need to have a strong water framework directive. And so I'd like to pull some of the conversation now into the business side. It's clear that Coca-Cola has had a very active role, both in terms of a user of water, but also a point that Veronica brought up that's so important is the relationship with the consumer. So Therese, I would really love to have your perspective on the Water Framework Directive, but also on businesses' responsibility to bring people on this journey so that they understand the importance of water and also what we're trying to do at the European level.
Yes, my pleasure. And thank you for being on this panel and sharing our view. And I'm standing here a little bit with two hats on because, as you said, we are leading and supporting, from a business point of view, a coalition of companies and organizations that are supportive of the WFD. And of course, I stand here as Coca-Cola, having our primary ingredient being water. So it is essential to everything we do, and that means that we've said that our water strategy should really be respectful with regards to this resource. And so that means we work across the 3 R's about reducing the amount of water we use, recycling the water we use in our production facilities so that it can be reused either inside our factories or outside for agriculture, for example. But also we need to replenish the water we use. And that is really giving the water back to nature and communities. And I think there is a very big opportunity, also further engaging, as you said, with people. And before you do that, you have to point out the relevance of doing so. And as we as Coca-Cola Company are a company of big numbers and a big global footprint, of course, I think it might be worthwhile sharing some of the results that we've established through our 10 years of work in the replenishment area, because this can give a nice segue into how do you engage others. So if you allow me. So a good decade ago, we set out this water stewardship program, which also includes the replenishment target. And we said for every drop we take to produce our drinks in our production facilities, we will give 1 back. So that means that when we started, we already started all kinds of projects across the globe. And at this moment, we replenish 160% of our sales volume globally. In Europe, that's 212%. And it goes across 43 programs in 18 different countries in the EU, because water knows no boundaries and knows no borders. So that also is already a very interesting link into the communities and the people that you serve, also from a European perspective. This is not only about replenishing the water, it's also about the restoration of nature and restoring land. So throughout all these projects in Europe, we've restored 365 square kilometers of water and land, which also has a clear benefit to biodiversity, but also ecotourism, agriculture, you name it. So there's a direct link to how this impacts people. And where you started also saying and referring to the pandemic, of course, we know as a global player that water is essential to all life and also especially to vulnerable communities. So through our global programs, we've also really addressed WASH, so access to clean and safe water for hygiene and sanitation. Absolutely crucial if you want to build resilient, stable communities and also, for example, give women the opportunity to grow and develop. You need to make sure they don't need to go miles every day to get their water, because that time can then not be spent on educational work or taking care of other elements that could help develop themselves. So I'm happy to expand more on some of the results that we've taken there, but my point would really be, if you as a company are taking green recovery very serious, and I'm seeing great statements from lots of our fellow organizations, you would need to put water at the center, at the heart of that. We've done so over a decade. We have great results to share, which can hopefully also make other organizations and other companies more happy to jump in and by showing what good it brings if you really connect all the dots and if you connect to the people and the communities that you are part of as an organization. So I'll pause here.
Great. Thank you very much, Denise. And the beauty of what you're saying is really the importance of connecting all those dots. And that's exactly also what Veronica started with and what the Green Deal is trying to do. And I think you bring up a few points that I'd like to bring into the second part of the conversation when we get into the discussion. One is I'm intrigued at the replenishment. I think replenishing in particular when you're coming at it from a limits to growth perspective, which is obviously 50 years of the Club of Rome and my being president, I've inherited this thinking around consumption and what do we really need to consume. But you also bring up the importance, again, of the role of business as the link between people and also policy, and ensuring also that we ensure a green recovery. And this brings me to another business, and obviously, David, that's your own, and through Ecolab, the kind of the work that you're trying to do through the optimization and efficiency of the use of water. And the way in which Ecolab has really played an active role in the Water Framework Directive to continue to ensure stringency. And I think, again, it's really important to commend the business community for all of you coming together behind the European Commission and saying, this is spot on, this is what we need. No, we're not going to continue to just consume for the sake of consuming. We have to assume our own responsibility. David, can you give me a little bit more of your insight in terms of what you're thinking through at Ecolab and build a little bit on what Therese has indicated?
Thank you, Sandrine. So good afternoon, everybody. I'll just, as an intro, just mention the focus of Ecolab. We work in three areas. One which is food safety, another one which is healthy environment, and the third pillar is water preservation. And last year we've helped the industry in Europe to preserve the equivalent of the consumption of the annual consumption of water of the city of Paris, just to put this in context. Now, obviously, in our conversation today, everybody is convinced that water is important to all of us, of our lives, and as well how we conduct business. Water is a scarce resource. Many indicators show that the demand is outpacing the supply, and that by 2030, sorry, there will be a need of 40% more water, but there is no new water. And water is not just a southern issue. It's not only in the middle of the Sahara, but there are not enough water. And just as then again give an example, the second most water-stressed city in Europe actually happens to be Brussels. And I think many of us are either living or going to Brussels. So it is really something that covers, a challenge that covers, you know, all the region. So, you know, the good news is clearly, and again, the conversation we're having today is illustrating this, Europe is wanting to take the lead. That there is appetite not only politically, but appetite as well from a business perspective. And there are many ways that smart water management can be done. I think Therese was mentioning a few examples around replenishment, and you know, a little bit later in the conversation we'll have the opportunity to go a little bit more in detail of that. Community projects, a lot of work going on as well in integrating natural capital as we think through financial investment. And then one area that obviously Ecolab is much more focused on is water efficiency and let's say the responsible management of water. And this can be done both by managing the efficiency and managing the wastewater through exactly in the same way as Coke was referring it, which is a reduce, reuse, recycle total water management approach. And just to give a little example again, I think sometimes some practical examples help as well. Referring back to Belgium, you know, Belgium is well known for its beer. And the beer industry over the last few years has been particularly active in reducing their water footprint, up to 70% reduction in the last 3 years of their water usage as they produce their goods. And that's an illustration as well of one of the industries that's taking the lead that can be taken as an example. So what I'd like to do maybe a little bit later, as we go into a bit more conversation around, you know, what's the business case at the end of the day to reduce water, is to try and give a few examples on how this can be done and share a few thoughts on that. Thank you.
That would be great, David. Thank you for that. And I think that you bring two very important points. Again, the potential for, I mean, it's quite phenomenal when you think that the beer industry has been able to reduce their water footprint by 70%. And what that actually does in terms of coming back to the points that Therese made, access to water, you know, the more we're able to actually reduce our footprint, the more we know that there will be more access to water. Now, clearly, Therese, what we didn't talk about was that we do in Europe have a greater access to water than obviously some of the more vulnerable communities that in particular are getting hit by COVID. And I think this is something that I do want to bring up into our discussion points, which again, Veronica and you brought up, which is water is everywhere. We tend to forget that actually water is such an important part of the nexus between other sectors as well as our livelihoods. And as we come back to a conversation around what's essential now post-COVID, let's not forget that alongside food security, water security is absolutely fundamental. So maybe we'll move now into the panel discussion, and then hopefully we'll have some time to open up a bit for some Q&A with those that have joined us on this call. One of the many calls that we all live through now as we're all in lockdown. I don't know about all of you, but I'm getting Zoomatica. It's my term for sitting too much, and I'm sure many of you on this call are having the same problem. So we'll try to be active. In any case, what are the main discussion points that we want to hit? And I'd love, Veronica, to start maybe with you coming back to kind of the Commission's perspective. I mean, first of all, your experience in terms of the Water Framework Directive, but also the way in which you felt stakeholders have really been active. You know, your work with the partnership, how do you feel that now with the Water Directive, you spoke a little bit about farm to fork and biodiversity. How does that fit in? My understanding is that there's been a great deal of pushback by some stakeholders with regard to the agricultural community in particular around the farm to fork and biodiversity links. Does water come into that as well? And what would be some of your advice also in terms of the member states? Again, many of the high-level conversations that we're all having is the European Green Deal is on a pathway to being turned into some very clear directives. But what about implementation on the ground? What about the member states? What about how the member states will actually implement the recovery and the conditionality clauses, etc.? Some thoughts starting with you, Veronica.
Thank you so much, Sandrine. So many very relevant questions. And let me start from the practical experience. What did we witness when we were carrying out the overarching fitness check on water acquis that indeed gave us a bit the temperature on the ground across all stakeholders? First of all, I would say that, as you said yourself, this is an area where ultimately there are a lot of convergent interest. I mean, both the civic society, the industry, everyone sees that water is indispensable. And sometimes I like to make the parallels to, you know, the beloved fiancé, the one that you tend to take for granted until the moment something goes wrong. And then you have, you know, some regrets if you want to correct her. So I must say, we've always been enthused to see that ultimately the intentions are similar. I think that the controversy arises about the pace at which we want to achieve progress. And for that, I think that the arrival of President von der Leyen, of the European Green Deal, of the clear time-framed objective for climate neutrality by 2050, accompanied by a set of policies that all must enable Europe to become cleaner, more resilient, more circular, because we are stressing a lot biodiversity and farm to fork. Let's not forget the very strong circular component in water management, has created a dynamics that indeed connects the dots and also gives the rhythm, if I may say. So the biodiversity strategy that we have just adopted defines the line to take for the European Union, the line that we will represent, subject, of course, to full agreement by all the member states at United Nations level, gives the path for the next 10 years. And we know out of United Nations science, let's face it, we would not have the Green Deal without all the reports of the United Nations and the civic society movement that was sparked out of that. 10 years to change. What is water here? Everywhere. And let me also stress, we often speak of water generally. Of course, there is a cycle of water in nature, but ultimately the fresh water part that we need so much for human livelihood purposes, it's 1% of the entire planet. 70% is covered by oceans and marine salted water. But I mean, the freshwater part, which is so quintessential, is indeed, as David said, a very, very scarce resource. How do I see things? I see things in the sense of, indeed, making sure that in designing this transition that we all, I think, ultimately deeply want, the companies, because they realize that this is the inevitable, so to say, future. I mean, water has been mentioned, I think, for 3 or 5 years in a row, I don't know the exact number, by the World Economic Forum as one of the biggest threat to business continuity. So, I mean, if I'm an entrepreneur and if I'm Coca-Cola, of course I know that this is something I need to protect. If I'm a consumer, I may see certain things a little bit less, but the only thing that I know for sure that the worst horror scenario can happen to me is that my tap water gets contaminated. COVID has already been a drama, but imagine if our drinking water gets contaminated. I mean, it's not to think of air pollution that I always say, the combination of these two would be. So we all want water quantity and water quality, in appropriate levels. And I think really the path where you see differentiation is at what speed, at which cost, etc. And this is where what you were raising, implementation on the ground, becomes very important. What can I report? That member states tell us that, even those that put the best of their commitment, they will not manage without a very strong support also from civic society and businesses. So unless the circle gets perfectly squared somehow, which is also the difficulty in there, but unless there is really this partnership approach and everyone does its bit, civic society helping also in enforcing, businesses in anticipating, in being proactive, and European Commission also in facilitating the transition through appropriate channeling of finance, we will not get there. But I think that at least from European Commission regulator side, there is a lot of goodwill and determination to go that way. Thank you.
Really, first of all, thank you for the reminder around the 1%. I think we do so tend to forget, and even though there is greater desalination technology, and we know that we can hopefully create that a greater pot of drinking water, it is unbelievably important that we preserve what we have and we replenish, exactly as was said. And thank you also for indicating the strategy at the member state level of needing to have all stakeholders involved, because it's so easy to get into the name and blame game, where everyone says, oh, we won't do anything until we have the policy in place. And then the policy actually comes, and then all you do is you get backlash. So this is, and that's why it's so important to have this conversation today, and these businesses that are supporting. Esther, coming back to the challenge actually that Veronica just put forward in terms of implementation in the member states, what is your thinking then, and what is WWF and other NGOs doing on the ground in order to create awareness actually for consumers and ensure that the Water Framework Directive is properly implemented, holding member states both accountable, but then ensuring that the information is there so that people understand why it's so important to look at water differently?
Thanks, Sandrine. I think it's worth highlighting that together with many other NGOs, at the beginning of the fitness check, we launched this Protect Water campaign, exactly to do this. So to call for the legislation to remain as it is and put more focus on implementation. And it's been the third largest public consultation ever in the history of the European Commission for an issue Wow. If you talk to your parents about Water Framework Directive, might sound that people immediately understand that is quite key, as I said, to preserve, healthy freshwater ecosystems in Europe. So over the last 2 years and more, we've done a huge amount of work of mobilizing our supporters, citizens, businesses as well, not just as WWF, but in a larger coalition, to really raise awareness about the importance of the WFD and the importance, as I said, of fast-track implementation. What's happening with implementation, where we see also some of these gaps? I think the first, it's been clearly that it's not just for water management authorities. It's been stressed again, but it's really for a stakeholder approach with businesses and civil society, and the Water Framework Directive governance mechanisms is also designed exactly to bring together all the relevant stakeholders, based on monitoring, on knowledge sharing, to set up the management plan. So the governance is conducive to the engagement of all the stakeholders. And this solution has been embraced also by many businesses, but there's still more space for more to join. One issue is clearly the inadequate financing. And that's one of the main reasons why water bodies are failing to reach good status. There's been a recent OECD report that's showing that all EU countries, with the exception of Germany, will need to increase annual expenditures for water supply and sanitation by 25%. And this is just to comply with the Drinking Water and Urban Waste Water Treatment Directive. So it does not really cover the investment needed on the Water Framework Directive. But we know that financing or lack of financing is an issue. And then exactly is where the money goes, we've all mentioned COVID and this time of uncertainty. I think it's more important than ever that the money goes into the right direction, and activities that are harmful to freshwater ecosystem are no longer subsidized or supported. I think there's more and more the evidence of the clear link between the destruction of ecosystems and this current pandemic and future pandemics and as well. So, for instance, we really need to discuss, about hydropower. We need to discuss about navigation, about agriculture as well, and to make sure that the activities are compatible with the protection of river, lakes, and other waters as well. Maybe a quick word also about and I think it's about the exceptions, for instance, because there are exceptions allowed in the directive. But they were meant to be really exceptional. And today, 53% of EU rivers are covered by at least one exception, 53%, and many of which are to allow to build more hydropower plants. So that's really an issue. Quick word about the European Innovation Partnership on Water that was set up by the European Commission. This is clearly an example as well that has contributed to sharing good practices. And this is what we need. We need also businesses and their expertise joining these different groups and task forces to share knowledge about, and Therese was referring to Coca-Cola experience, for instance, to set up more effective and efficient waste treatment solutions, mitigate water stress, ensure best practices for water management in urban areas, and there are many. So that's also a call for more to join and to share that. And I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Not only is my intelligence increasing just through this conversation about water, there's so many figures that I didn't know before. That's really fascinating. You bring up 2 points that I'm going to bring up with you again, David, and I'd like Therese and the others as we go into a full conversation to think about, because the inadequate financing is fundamental, and part of that is perversities in the market. So as you say, we should actually be taxing polluters. We should also cost externalities, and that comes to, David, a point that you made around natural capital and the fact that actually water is not seen as natural capital. And we've always said that we need to start thinking about natural capital as having a value, and that's fundamental. And I think we should have a broader conversation about this, because I don't think we're going to get very far just with policy if we don't actually putting a value on those resources that are so important for us. The other point, Esther, that you bring up is this very important point around hydropower. And Veronica, I'll come back to you on that point, because that obviously comes into our renewables policy and the way in which we look at energy, and then we get into the water energy nexus. And I think that's super important as well. It comes into that kind of systemic approach that we need to think about. You know, not everything is perfect. It's also the shift in electrification when we look at battery technology and the fact that we're moving out of one issue, which is fossil energy, and creating potentially another issue through materials use. So I think that's another really important point that I hope that both David also and Therese can think a little bit about as we move into more thinking from the business perspective. What I'd like to ask both of you to reflect upon is, you've already given a few of your case studies, but some more experience that you have, good, positive experience, solutions. And also, I mean, we always kind of are rah-rah about all the great solutions, but can we also look at the fault lines and the tensions? Because I think it's really important, even if we're all here thinking that we can do this, we need to think about what are still the outstanding challenges. And again, a lot of those outstanding challenges are at the national level because the leadership is clearly coming from the European level. So I don't know if you want to start, Therese, and then we'll move into David.
Yes, absolutely. But a lot of questions to cover, Sandrine. So help me if I forget to answer some of your questions. So maybe on the natural capital thinking, what struck me when I entered the area of water a little bit more in this role was that there is so much knowledge, but it really sits in pockets of specific organizations, like, for example, WWF. And so it is important for companies like Coca-Cola to really unlock that and understand. And by having our water strategy that I explained and doing so many of those replenishment projects, I've had the pleasure, and many of my colleagues in our countries have had the pleasure to really come and see and learn what happens. And if you allow me, I will share an anecdote real quickly, but I still remember standing in a field with some of the esteemed WWF colleagues in Eastern Europe. And they were looking at a river and they said, "Ah, beautiful." And I said, "Yes, it's very nice. I see water, I see birds. Beautiful. But what am I really looking at?" And then they said, "Well, the river now is meandering." And I said, "Okay, yes. Why is that important?" And then they looked at me with big eyes and said, "I'm sorry, I'm not a biologist. Explain it to me." And then they said, "Before this, the river was running straight." Okay, yes, again, and now it's meandering. And then I really asked him to talk to me like I'm a 6-year-old, to make me understand what nature should look like, what a river, for example, and a riverbed should look like, and that it needs to meander in order to let the water really reach all kinds of depths, and that's good for biodiversity, etc., etc. Until I was told, again, like a 6-year-old, what I needed to see, it was very difficult for me to really understand the value of water and, for example, the value of the nature restoration that we were investing in. And then by understanding also what WWF in this case did with the local communities, talking to the local communities and the local governments, why this was important and what kind of benefits this was giving them. In the end of the day, we all want to know, as human beings, as policymakers, as companies, what's in it for us. And making local communities understand that working on a river will give them better yield on fish, better water quality, even ecotourism, all those kind of benefits, that's super essential. So that would be my call out. Also, when we look at implementing this better and talking about natural capital, so actually bringing a value to what water and nature restoration and natural capital investment does, is really flesh out what these specific elements are and try to keep in mind that many of these people who actually need to do something with it, they're like me. So you need to talk to them like they're a 6-year-old and explain it, because we haven't studied biology or we haven't read all those wonderful, great scientific papers, but we are willing to understand what we can do and how we can help move forward, because as I said, water is essential and people do get that.
Wow, I'm really taken by your anecdote, and I'll add to it by saying that actually there's now a new phenomenon that many scientists are talking about, which is urban memory rather than nature memory. And I think it's really important as we have this conversation, because if we are going to communicate to people like they're 6-year-olds, or if we're actually going to communicate to them like they're adults, but at least ensure that we pass the message as if they were 6-year-olds, because otherwise I think they'd be pretty pissed off. What we need to do is remember that there are many youth in urban situations who do not feel that actually nature will regenerate or reboost them. They also do not know that water is water and natural and doesn't just come out of the tap, in the same way that they may not know that they get milk from a cow. And what many of us need to do in the science and the economic community, and this is part of the conversations that we're now leading, is understand that actually for them it's going to a skate park that gives them their pleasure. It's not necessarily understanding that a river may meander rather than go straight. And that is what I was trying to say about, we have to also get away sometimes from this romanticized notion of what is these resources, so that we can better communicate to some of those communities that are never going to understand it unless we put it in terms which they will understand, hopefully. But I think your anecdote is fundamental. And trying to transpire that. And David, maybe you can build on that and give some examples of also how you've been able to explain on the ground the importance of the work that you're doing and where water stands.
Thanks, Sandrine. And I think I'm just going to bounce back on that, I think, word you were using, which is at the end of the day, this continuous education around water, because we all take it so much just for granted. And when we try and take a kind of a business perspective on that, I think the first element, there's probably two elements in call it the business case to smart water management. But I'd like to highlight, there are many others, but the two main ones I would say is really around business impact. You know, in many, there's a lot of literature, but you know, some of the latest ones are showing that globally over $250 billion per year are impacted, the economies are impacted by the lack of water availability. And you know that the loss to the global economy doesn't only stop here in terms of impact to the economy, but it's as well affecting, you know, two major sectors that we're very familiar, obviously, here in Europe, which is agriculture and industry. And industry actually in Europe consumes over 50% of the fresh water. And so that there's really an important role for the industry to have in preserving that resource. And again, you know, we're still fighting the idea that water's an issue now only in southern states in the middle of the Sahara. And let me take again another example. Last summer, which was a warm summer, and we'll see what this summer will be, where in the land of 1,000 lakes, i.e. Finland, even Finland has challenges on water, and there was a large paper mill that had to reduce by 20% for a few weeks their production because the lack of access of water in parts of the world such as Finland. So clearly, managing water in a smart way is not just a good corporate citizen action. That actually makes sense to ensure business growth and continuity. The second link, and you came to that as well, is that connection with energy, right? So when we're thinking Green Deal, when we're thinking circular economy, climate, clearly water has an important role to play in there. And there's a good link between water and energy. And you know, saving water helps as well to save energy. And energy is a very clear, let's say, bill that industry understands and can see on their bottom line immediately. Not necessarily everybody knows, but you know, for instance, in a municipality, on average, 40% of the electricity bills bill, sorry, goes from pumping, moving, treating water. Huge impact on the overall bill impact, financial impact of the municipalities. And so reducing water reduces your bill. Now, obviously, things are never quite simple because as we think as well about energy and the fact that we are focused on energy efficiency first, we are looking as well at transitioning, and some of the energy sources are more water hungry than fossil fuel. So thinking about the water energy nexus in terms of opportunity to reduce your energy by reducing your water, we need as well to look at the source of energy to ensure that we don't replace one energy by another one that could create another issue, which is water. So connection pretty close. But those two examples I was trying to bring, or the 2 points I was trying to bring in terms of growth and link to the energy consumption are showing that building a business case for an industry to manage smartly their water allows them to grow, allows them to have a positive impact on their energy bill, and as well has a positive impact on the carbon footprint. So hopefully that's a couple of examples that.
So that's a series of win-wins. And I think it's pretty clear that, again, just in the course of not even an hour, 45 minutes, you guys have thrown out a series of percentages and positives and win-wins that actually should be put in a checklist that is sent to all consumers and citizens so they really understand this. I hope business is doing this, and also that with the Commission, because I can see a one-pager that is sent to everyone so they understand the water energy nexus, so they understand their role on water consumption, what they can actually do. I think that would be phenomenal if we could do that, if it doesn't already exist. Can I open it up for a general conversation amongst the panel and anyone else that wants to reflect on some of the things that have been said? And while we do that, can I ask those that have already asked questions on the Q&A? Ignacio, I see that you've already asked a question. We'll come to that question. But if others have questions, can you please put it in the Q&A, and also maybe just which company you're from, because I'm sorry, there's such a long list of participants. I can't quite see where these questions are coming from. And anyone from the panel that wants to reflect on what someone else has said?
Sandrine, maybe quickly on Therese's experience about the importance of free-flowing rivers. This is clearly something that is on WWF agenda. And of course, I think there's a huge part of education, engagement, and even personal, I come from a city in Spain, which has one of the largest, rivers in Spain, Ebro. And people are personally very attached to this part of the water because it's part of what we are as well. It's part of identities. So I think that's really important. But also a point about the importance of restoring free-flowing rivers. And what are also other tools that we could use? And clearly, again, WFD is one of the tools. We just had a recent case in which WWF, together with other environmental organizations, was really leading on stopping the construction of a dam in the Pyrenees, in the Gallego River. It's one of the smaller rivers coming into the Ebro as well. And one of the reasons is the WFD. So we also have other means as NGOs, as you're saying, and civil society, which is taking the legal action and supporting the local communities to bring that forward into the courts. And we just had a recent success that I think is worth celebrating. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's so important, the role of civil society, both in terms of informing the population and citizens, but also playing that accountability game. I mean, it is, we wouldn't actually be able to hold member states so accountable for so many infringements on environment if we didn't have incredible NGOs like WWF and others that are doing this. I mean, this is your incredible work, and again, I commend you for that, because it's so necessary. And if you look on climate as well, it has been absolutely fundamental in terms of holding certain nations accountable, as well as companies and communities. So Ignacio, I'm going to say thank you for giving me where you're from. I, for some reason, cannot send you a message back. And so I just wanted you to say that I acknowledged that you wrote in. And I see Ava's also come in, and Ananda is from WWF. Is there someone else, though, before we get into the questions from the panel that would like to reflect on what Esther has said or someone else from the panel has said?
Maybe I can step in very briefly, Sandrine, if you allow me. So just to say, we have been touching, as you said, on so many important hooks. One is the value of water. I think David was making a very, very powerful case about, energy efficiency. The agenda has been so clear. Every company realizes, the usefulness of reducing energy cost. I think that companies, and this has come up very vividly from the panel I was moderating this morning, companies are increasingly becoming aware of the usefulness of also reducing their water cost. But indeed, the angle is more under this trend of, because it's a scarce resource, than under the cost. Why? Because we have found, and the fitness check is very clear on that, a serious also under implementation of our Article 9 of the Water Framework Directive adopted back in the year 2000, and requiring all the member states to secure that they have a pricing policy for water that really stimulates the principle of cost recovery, the efficient use of water. So what is the Commission doing right now on this point? We're really mapping very granularly the way in which all the member states have implemented this article, because it's high time, I think, that we also have the right price of water, as you say. The purpose is not the one to let the consumers pay even more than they do. Between us, by the way, I find it pretty unfair that today it's mainly consumers that pay. Certainly also industries pay the part, but we're not having a real price for farming production, for example.
Yes.
So there are imbalances in the way we've been implementing this article throughout this year, and we have to do it also accompanied by an agenda of incentives, which is also required by the Water Framework Directive. It's about incentivizing and recognizing those that do well and actually already are on an agenda of water efficiency. So I think we are moving into times which are really fascinating in terms of, revamping the narrative to really give the right price of water. Let me draw your attention to the fact that the Commission has been very vivid in announcing a building renovation wave. Yeah. I look at that work strand, which is led by our colleagues in DG Ener, but with which we work very, very closely, as very, very important, because it will be rather emblematic of whether we succeed or not to have a really solid agenda for water and energy efficiency purposes combined. Ultimately, from a public school, hospital, household perspective, what you want is that your water pipes are efficient, don't have leakages, the water comes from the tap clean, sure, but also in the right quantities, maybe not leading to overuses. At the same way, you also want an energy efficient infrastructure and spare where you can on cost. So we are really at an interesting juncture for changing our approach in this area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And that's why I keep on coming back to COVID. I think that the indirect but very important aspect of the learnings from COVID has been that we have to now start to design our systems properly in order to function with greater resilience post-COVID and in preparation for future shocks, because we know we're going to have further shocks, whether they be health shocks, climate shocks, etc. So what you say is so important, because again, it comes into that integrated approach around systems, whether it's a mobility system, an energy system, a building of new urban system with the renovation wave that we're going to see, where we have to think about every aspect of that renovation, which is not just the building itself, but it's supplying the building with water, with energy, with everything else. And that is so fundamental. And again, this is why I believe that your colleagues in the Commission, is so important that when we look at the European Green Deal, we look at the interrelated aspects between every part of the Green Deal package and the directives that will come out. And luckily, it is clear that your colleagues are doing that. And I see that we are breaking down silos through this process, which is also a very important result of the European Green Deal. David and Therese, before we go to questions, do either one of you have a reflection?
Yeah, I wanted to build, if you allow me, because I absolutely agree that the EU Green Deal shows so many great touch points and designs the ecosystem to really make a difference together. But I think where businesses can do an additional job and make a difference is really bringing this to the consumer and bring this to life, because we can otherwise make policies and legislate and implement within our own factories or production plants or in our own value chains whatever we want. But in the end, it's also about the consumer understanding the role, what they can do, but also how they can raise their voice. And what makes me confident is that when we started this business coalition to support the Water Framework Directive,
And you now have 26 businesses, right?
Exactly. I was going to tell you that we have great news. We started with 23, and I believe we have them on the slide, so maybe the organizers can pull them up, because I feel it's important to give that recognition to the 23 that were with us from the very start. And it's an interesting bunch of companies and labels that are willing to take their own responsibility and also to step up their game within their organizations, their own platforms, and also towards consumers where possible. And so it's great that since we started mid-April, we've been able to add 3 new members. So Keen, NCL News and Media, and NICWEX Outdoor Innovation to really come and join. And they said, well, maybe we're a little bit different from the Coca-Colas or the Heinekens or the Ecolabs in this world, but we're willing to chip in with our own responsibility. And I think if you think about the EU Green Deal and thinking about leaving no one behind, you also need businesses who are willing to step up their game and make the connection into their own communities and their own consumer groups and their own platforms to really help drive that acceleration. Because you rightfully talked about tipping point at the beginning, and I'm a firm believer that businesses can be a force for good and can help really make that tipping point happen and accelerate towards a change that absolutely is fundamental for the future.
No, Therese, you're right. And especially those businesses who have an open consciousness and who understand their sense of responsibility. Unfortunately, there's still some businesses and leaders out there. I hold the accent of a country who has forgotten their sense of responsibility to citizens and the world. But anyway, moving on from that very tricky political point, David, did you want to make one last intervention before we open it up to the questions? Because we're getting some great questions here.
Maybe I mean, we've covered many aspects, of course, of let's say the opportunity here. And again, I'm trying to give a bit of a business case view, right? I think Madame Manfredi was mentioning as well incentives, and we, as you know, water, to the opposite of energy, is a very local issue, right? So it tends to be very specific to each location as we pump from the same pond, albeit the community, agriculture, or the industry. And so the usage of water, maybe sometimes as well the regulation around water, tends to be a very local specific one. So it's quite complex. Now, at the same time, continuing to push to have mechanisms to make the right choice and as well incentivize the water reuse as long as it is safe to do so, I think is probably something that would be very helpful. In some cases, again, for the businesses, understanding the incentivization mechanism is sometimes pretty complex. And so folks will tend to hold back a bit until there's a better understanding on what that mechanism is. And then the second point, which I think was mentioned as well around the value of water, again, I think many of us tend to consider water as being something which is, for granted, right? Because again, the cost of water is quite different to the actual value it has. And so in some cases, we're not thinking enough in terms of preserving water, and in some politicians as well in these situations. So thinking in terms of investing in the infrastructure, as we have a leakage, I think an average leakage rate in Europe of 30%, would be as well another great way to have an action right now to help and preserve water and do the right thing. So these are a couple of elements I just wanted to share.
Great, thank you for that. So maybe now I'll move into the questions and I'll throw out a few before we go into answering. There's a couple of really good questions here from Ignacio de San Pio, from Rise. One around the importance of looking at water efficiency, and is there water efficiency certification that we might want to think about with regard to industry? Is there a way that we can create a tool that companies can use officially to show how efficient they are beyond just their reporting requirements? So that's one. And the other, which I think is very important, is also talking about water rights and trading water rights in the same way that we speak about trading CO2. Could be one thought in terms of really bringing forward the value of water. This comes into really creating that value proposition. Another, which is quite interesting, from Eva Hernandez from WWF, is whether we think that the lack of awareness is really just around limited to the youth, or if it's much broader, and how do we actually really bring the population at large into this conversation and make them understand how important it is. Maybe what I'll do is just give a quick anecdote linked to this, because I will never forget an anecdote that I received from an Australian water company already 10 years ago, when they were in the midst of having a huge drought. And they had to decide on two ways forward. One was basically tell the entire population that their water bills were going to double because of the drought, or actually first communicate with them, bring together everyone and indicate that if we work together and if we reduce our use, then we actually will only have to increase it by maybe a quarter and maybe less. And just by having that conversation and bringing the consumer into the decision making rather than immediately increasing the price, meant that everybody actually made an effort, and they would only increase the price by a quarter. And I think that's both a way of showing the responsibility of water producers, water users, but also the way in which we can communicate. So maybe I'll leave those three questions for you first, and then we'll move into the other questions. There's lots of really good other questions. Who would like to start?
I'm happy to start on the water efficiency one, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And I think if I understand the question correctly, is around how do we quantify water efficiency, right? So that's a great.
Can we do that through official certification schemes, and is that necessary, as well as potentially also putting in place a trading scheme?
So again, I think many people think energy and compare energy to water. Water is such a local issue that water efficiency in one basin means something different to another basin. So if you have not enough water, being water efficient, it doesn't translate in the same way versus you've got plenty of water. So, and that's called context-based targeting. And we've actually developed a common good tool, which is called the Water Risk Monetizer. That was with a few NGOs, with the World Resource Institute, to firstly be able to better model water levels at the different basins, then be able to calculate in production terms the impact of water limitations. So that means if I'm a company producing cars, what will the water scarcity or water availability mean in terms of car production? Or if I'm producing ice cream, or if I'm producing paper. And that is a language which is much easier to understand when you're in the industry. If I am limited, if I'm producing 1,000 cars a day And with my current water abstraction, I will be in the next 2 years not be able to produce 2,000 a day. That immediately allows you, one, to build the actual case as to why do I need to manage water. And secondly, it gives me a target by which I need to reduce my water consumption.
Right.
If it's in perspective, if you think about, for instance, what happened at day zero in the south of in South Africa, in Cape Town, everybody was knowing that day zero was coming. The industry was doing their part in terms of reducing water. They did it, but still there was a water issue, which meant the target wasn't met. And that's through context-based targeting and one of these technologies that I've just described, you can help and define what your target should be at a local level.
Okay, so, but I'm going to come back to Therese and Esther and also Veronica. If one of you could answer this question, because I think it's important. Do we need to have companies actually certified with regard, or at least some very deep reporting requirements around how they use water and efficiency? And secondly, do we need to think about potentially trading rights, even though David says it's very, very complicated because of the localization of the water issue? So what other mechanisms do we actually need beyond setting the right target? Is there a need for more stringent mechanisms, both in terms of reporting and also in terms of putting a value? Therese or one of the others want to reply to this?
I'm happy to give it a first go. So from a company perspective, I see that we already do a lot of reporting on water specifically, but also on the nexus to other sustainability topics. And so that is also relevant for Dow Jones Sustainability Index, CDP, whatever. So there's so many things that we are already doing. So if you're just asking me black and white, if I would sign up for extra reporting, I'm not sure. I think the question would be, what is the benefit that it would give us? Or how can we help already disclose the data that we already have better? Because reporting just for reporting purposes is, I don't think anybody's going to be happy of that. So I think it's about disclosure and really also interpretation of that data and sharing that. And with that, building joint action plans. So I guess that's a little bit also through the anecdote that you shared of the Australian example. And if I look at what we are moving into with our new water strategy that we'll be launching later this year, is that really looking at the local risk mapping and connecting that with the more international or global data that we have also through WRI. But then the question comes, what do you do with that? How do you disclose that? And how do you use that also in conversations with the local water suppliers, with the local governments, etc.? So for me, it's really about disclosing and working with that data, not per se creating more reporting lines.
And I think you bring up a really good point. And Veronica, I'd like to bring this up because someone else has just asked if we could really hone in on this and look at real production efficiency and real impact. Because even if water availability is a local thing, there still is an impact, clearly, in terms of, and that's a question coming from Ignacio. And I guess, so having worked with business, we don't need more non-essential reporting requirements. It's very clear. And in particular for small and medium-sized enterprises, it's totally killing them and they're not part of the process. We need to be smart, clearly. And thank you, Morten, for bringing up the green taxonomy, since I'm part of the taxonomy and I was just going to actually refer to it, because yes, the green taxonomy can actually help here. The reason I wanted to come to you, Veronica, is that we do have a data gap, and disclosure is fundamental, but not everyone is reporting to CDP. So how do we actually ensure that businesses do properly gather the right data? And how do we then link it up to our do no significant harm and our green taxonomy criteria? Because that's exactly what we're now starting to do, is to create this framework, not only to help the investment community understand what's green, and for you as businesses to be able to go to the investment community and say, we are now investing in this brand new plant that is going to be top of the line, net zero emissions, water efficient, etc. The problem we have is we can't evaluate what that means in practice. That is the struggle that we had in the taxonomy. So Veronica or Esther, do you want to come into this also, because WWF sat on the taxonomy, but more on the disclosure side?
Maybe on following on what on the question, and also maybe first to pick up the question from my colleague Eva Hernandez, who is our coordinator for Living European Rivers. And this is exactly one of the initiatives in WWF that we are working on, creating this movement across Europe and really changing the status about how we discuss about water, how we engage, and how we invest as well. I think that's quite important. And on her question, I think a lot of us, let's be honest, I think we've lost sight of how important, and I know it sounds very blunt, how important is nature, water, all these ecosystems to sustain our life on the planet. I think it's something nice that now we've all discovered during the lockdown that we have forests and we can have clean air, you know, and no.
Yeah, but remember that's you and I and many others who live in good green areas.
Exactly.
But I can tell you that the woman that's been beaten in her small apartment or has 7 kids doesn't recognize it.
Exactly. So there's a whole issue there, and it's not just population. I think it's all across. I think we've forgotten the key role that nature plays in our own well-being as well.
Yes.
And I think now we have an opportunity with the European Green Deal and many others to put it much more at the forefront for all of us, as you said. And I think it's not a luxury. It shouldn't be considered as a luxury. I think it's essential for all of us. On what we were saying about data and reporting, we have an initiative in WWF, which is called the Water Risk Filter that we develop. And what we are doing with that is we are encouraging companies to use it to assess their water risk and also find ways to mitigate it. So including taking part in restoration projects, you know, because healthy rivers also mean lower water risk, so less droughts, less floods for everyone. So this is an initiative that we are also, you know, making available for companies and businesses as well. On the taxonomy, also very close to our heart in WWF as well. Well, of course, I think what we need to develop now is also the brown taxonomy as well.
Yes.
And we are pushing strongly for that. Now, finally, the taxonomy now has been concluded. And we would need also the delegated acts. But the taxonomy also provides clear criteria to guide the investments. And it should be not just the private investment, it should be also the public investment.
Which is happening now with conditionality, which is
exactly.
Great.
So we hope that we will be seeing that in the national recovery plans. And as I said before, that harmful infrastructures like dams and others are not going to be subsidized or supported as part of the recovery.
Yeah, those are very good points. And you bring up also the importance of understanding ecosystems. And there's several questions, and I'm going to come to you, Veronica, because I think there's several points that we need to bring up. One is the question from Ana Antario Geraldes, and I'm hoping that I am not totally killing these names, and Arantxa Aguar, which is very much also around the ecosystems. And Eva brought up this very important point as well. I mean, clearly we need people to understand the importance of ecosystems to their livelihoods again. And I think that's fundamental. And how can we do that? Some would say that we have to have better stakeholder engagement. Others would say that we have to have better science and research systems. So environmental education, which is coming up in some of these questions. So Veronica, it would be really great to get your take on what more do you think is really important as we move through this process, not only of the Water Framework Directive, but also of the links that we have through the European Green Deal and the broader picture of what Esther indicated, which is well-being, which is very close to my heart, coming again from the Club of Rome and the work that we're doing on well-being indicators and moving beyond growth indicators.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. I think that the overarching leitmotif of what is happening within the European Green Deal is to try and restructure our entire economy to allow all of us to live well within the planetary boundaries, which was the motto of the 7th Environmental Action Programme. And I think now we have a much more holistic perspective to get there. Esther said we should never underestimate the importance of nature for our lives. You made a very valid point, I fully subscribe to it, that today our teens have no idea even that, you know, nature is somehow it's also well-being. So the subtitle of the biodiversity strategy is bringing nature back to our lives, and it looks at the lives of people living in cities. This is really at the heart of what we are doing. How do we get there? Experience, practice, stories. You know, I will never belong to the camp of the pessimists, because when I started joining DG Environment, we were negotiating the single-use plastic directive, a directive that has taken the co-legislator 6 months to legislate and agree, leading de facto to the ban of some of the most recently found single-use plastic items on our beaches. Why? Because people were behind us. Because people had understood something simple. It's simply not good if you find plastic items creating islands in the oceans. So how do we get there? By raising this awareness in a really punchy manner. And people are ready to change, provided a path is designed, the goal is clear. So I personally sympathize a lot with Ignacio's suggestion to, at some stage, have some sort of certificates for water efficiency purposes as well. Let me tell you that somehow you maybe don't know, but they are inbuilt today in some of the eco-label systems that you find when you buy, you know, your next refrigerator or your next fridge. But what I find a little bit tricky is the fact that we have given a lot of visibility to the energy parameters and a bit less to the inbuilt water efficiency parameter, which are also there. So I think it's a matter of marketing these things better. And this also joins the the concerns of Teresa, whom I fully sympathize with, although, I mean, I would sympathize even more if it would come from the mouth of a micro company, but still there are a lot of reporting requirements for companies, I agree. So it's about selling better the efforts that the companies are in any event doing, and enabling the consumer to understand these efforts, because ultimately the Green Deal will not become a reality without also the sustainable consumption strand. So sustainable finance, yes, stop what you're doing, taxonomy, drive the money that we have in our pockets into the right direction for financial investment purposes, but without also getting, you know, the lady that is sitting in her apartment with the 7 children in the right choice the next time she buys her detergent for cleaning dishes, because she may also have a sympathy, she may also wish to change, but we have to make these choices much easier for consumers to understand. I have a bit more hesitations about the idea of installing trading water rights, I must say. I'm always happy to discuss, because I mean, it's a very innovative idea, kind of an ETS scheme for water rights. But the hesitations here come precisely from what many panelists have stressed. Water is a very local issue. And more than trading, here I see an issue of solidarity, transparency, solidarity. I am extremely intrigued by the big question no one of us is still raising, but we should be raising, which is, we have parts of Europe that are already today much more hit by water droughts than others, and parts of Europe that are already today much more hit by water floods. So we have, I would say, an imbalanced situation in terms of water quantities. Typically, we should think of some sort of a water union, in the same way we have been driving the European Union towards energy union to become more resilient and more autonomous strategically. But water indeed is local by definition. But still, could we imagine mechanics whereby the, let's say, richest, the parts of Europe which are more rich in water can help the parts of Europe which are less rich in water, and which there I see an issue for trading mechanism. How could this be, so to say, paid back, but not strictly speaking trading rights in water as such, but mechanism of solidarity and cooperation between member states. This is something that certainly I dream of as a European policymaker. And finally, just to say that the taxonomy is very much in our radar screen those days. We are working intensely with colleagues in DG FISMA on all the delegated acts. That will be the next challenge. And in that context, of course, hydropower comes as an example of an area where we have to balance the need for, in particular, securing energy storage versus the need not to create new harm by hampering biodiversity. And I think the devil is in the details as usual, but I think if you go on a case-by-case approach, looking at what we have as a guidance already today in the water framework and the restrictive interpretation to be given to the exceptions, we can have a rather clear steer for financial investment purposes as well.
Thank you for that. Some really important points, and I think that you're absolutely right. I think beyond just the fact that we should talk about a water union, I think this ethical question, if we start trading water, again, it's a resource that should be accessible to everyone, and then all of a sudden we start to think about trading. What if we hoard? What if some? I don't know. It becomes a real ethical issue as well. I think there's a question here that's come up, and I don't know who can answer this one. Maybe it comes back to you, David. It's around the setbacks associated with distilling salt water on industrial scale. Because again, you bring up, Veronica, the issue of there are parts of Europe that have more access than others. Do we want, we know that 1% of our water is fresh water, as you indicated, and I think that was a global figure, right? So what about new technology with regard to desalination, and does that make sense at an industrial scale for domestic use in Europe? We talk about it more in the Middle East and in Africa and elsewhere, but what about looking at desalination as an option?
So desalination, I think it's used a lot in Malta, for instance, as an example. But the two technologies that are currently available is thermal desalination, which is probably the main one, which is used in Saudi or in that part of the world. The challenge, of course, is the carbon footprint, because the amount of energy you need to use in order to heat up the water to basically take the salt away creates a totally different issue on the carbon footprint. A lot of work is going on membrane desalination, and I think many probably people on the phone are aware of that. Not as efficient for the moment. That's where all the focus is in terms of technology to remove salt, so basically filtering it out rather than heating it up, if I can simplify that. But then the challenge you have is, okay, you do that, then how do you transport the water to where you need it? And then you go into that transportation aspect, and so it's not a straightforward answer, and therefore, just like with energy, where we put in place the energy efficiency first principle, we could probably take exactly the same aspect with regards to water efficiency first principle, which is first try and use as little as you can, right? Use a business sense around that as well, because clearly reducing water is not just an impact on your water bill, which, as we know, probably is not really reflecting the actual value of it, but it has a big impact on your bottom line when you link it to what you're producing or your energy consumption you have. And then desalination, or let's say finding other sources, could be something you could consider at a later stage, but then you've got to mitigate this issue of what technology you use and how do you transport the water to that location.
Good point, which then obviously has a polluting impact as well. So coming to that, actually, I'm going to ask Therese for one last answer to this question, which is from Arantxa, and I think it's a really good one, which is that we keep on talking about water as a cost issue. We talk about it also as a need to be more efficient, to have the quality, but we don't necessarily, and this is where it comes to some of what you're doing at Coca-Cola, look at our responsibility as industry with regard to the ecosystem and preserving the ecosystem. So do you really feel that there's a broader base across industry where they're understanding their responsibility to the preservation of waterways and water ecosystems? Or do you feel that there's still a huge learning curve there? And while you think of your answer to that question, can I ask all the panelists to have one closing reflection? Very quick, I'm going to come back to all of you, and then I will summarize what I've heard.
So to answer your question, I think it's fair to say that there is still opportunity to bring more organizations on board of really understanding their responsibility when it comes to water inside their own processes and outside, and how this interlink. And for sure, I mean, Coca-Cola has been doing a lot, and I've tried to give some examples, but for sure, we also need to do more. Also, because of the gravity of the whole climate change, the impact we have on the climate, and the impact that climate has on us and our livelihoods and our business. So there is so much more that we need to do. So we all have to step up our game, no matter where you are and how far you are in your awareness process. But I do see good examples. I do see companies being ready for that. I do see companies also saying, okay, help me do that, big and small, different kind of industries. And I think it's also a little bit who you are and where you have your connections as a company or as an industry. To give you an example, also I think related to COVID. So Coca-Cola has always had a very strong community link, and we've always tried to empower women, for example. So for us, water and women are very connected. So for us, that's a very powerful and natural link, so to speak, to work in our communities to empower women, to not only give them access to safe and good quality of water and sanitation and hygiene, but also then try and work with them to educate. That can be basic education, but it can also be to educate them to become sustainable farmers and to build a better sustainable practice in their communities through water management or something else. So there are so many ways that you as a company can try and help make a difference, not only by doing what's needed first in terms of your own responsibility in your own production facilities and your supply chain, but also taking that a step beyond. And for us, that's communities, depending on who you are and where you operate, that might be something else. But I think that's also the beauty, because you can really connect this to your own identity and see what benefits it brings, because water is so connected and so essential to all.
Thank you for that. Good. So final thoughts, Veronica, very quick. What is your kind of feeling about what's next?
Look, I hope we have both young and less young people in the audience. My key message is, dear friends, the next 5 years ahead are wonderful for people that are really engaged in water issues, because so much is moving, and with your help, but only with your help, we can move it into the right direction. The implementation of the farm to fork strategy opens up incredible opportunities for organic farming, precision farming, efficient management of water for agricultural purposes. The implementation of the biodiversity strategy with its 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers opens up opportunities for biologists, passionate of nature, engineers. It's so much about driving innovation in the way we conciliate the nature, the clean energy, and the other targets. And I'm a believer in, what mankind can still invent and deploy on the market. The circular economy implementation is wonderful. It opens up so many fields on which Water Innovation Europe, by the way, is engaged since many, many years, and they're not the only ones, in looking at the many materials we can still also derive from an intelligent water treatment. We are revising the wastewater treatment directive and driving that revision into transforming the wastewater plants of the future into generators even of clean energy there where possible.
Okay.
Certainly reducing their carbon potential.
I'm going to have to stop you there, Veronica, because I think you would go on for hours with enthusiasm.
Voilà. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Esther.
Wow. I would say one message that has come up very clearly, I think is everyone's duty and responsibility, I think, to protect and restore ecosystems, including freshwater ecosystems. So we have the legal tools in place, which is the Water Framework Directive. And we know that one of the key principles in the Water Framework is the river basin approach. And now, right now, the member states will start doing the third the third river basin management plans for 21-27. So that's clearly an opportunity for all the stakeholders to engage and to make sure that we reach the objectives of having 100% of EU freshwater ecosystems in a healthy state by 27. As Ms. Manfredi, I'm also an optimist, and I think we can get there. And as we say in WWF, together possible. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, in this decade of action, it's absolutely fundamental, right? Therese.
Well, it's hard to top these ladies, but I would say think about what's in it for you if you respect water as a shared resource. So I'm specifically inviting businesses to understand what's in it for them and what could be the benefits and how it interlinks with everything they are working on and they know is coming also through the EU Green Deal. And I think there's a great group of companies and organizations out there that are willing to share their experiences, good and bad, and also that are willing to learn and share their voice whenever something is important like the Water Framework Directive. So if there's any company willing to join us as a business group, they're more than happy to, and we'll be more than willing to share and also learn back from those new members.
So my challenge to you is next time we speak in the next few months, I want that list to have doubled to 50.
I would welcome your help on that, but you sure have our commitment.
Okay, you got it. David.
Well, just 2 points. At the end of the day, what's good for water is good for business. And if we want to go green, we need to go blue.
Okay, good. So what's good for water is good for business. I'd say what's good for water is good for the planet. And I think our motto has always been at the Club of Rome, and now with our Planetary Emergency Partnership, healthy people, healthy planet. So this comes in nicely. I'm going to finish off by commending again the fact that we have these incredible companies that have worked in a stakeholder relationship and in partnership with the Commission. Thank you, Veronica, for all the leadership that the European Commission is showing on these issues and for your work. And thank you, David, also, and obviously Therese, for leading these companies on this charge. Of course, we wouldn't be where we are if we didn't have WWF reminding us every single day when we're not going far enough. And having worked with the European office since its inception, I think that it's so important to continue to have a strong WWF Europe that's doing that, Esther. So I commend you and your team, and Eva, who's reminding us very clearly that actually, and this is how I want to finish, that excess water is not an existence. We don't have excess water. We have harmonious resources within our planetary boundaries, and that's what we started with. And within this COVID, I guess my closing thought is, let's think about this. This has been the greatest transformational change in the last 3 months. We've been told as a community, and I've worked in the environmental community for 30 years, that transformation is not possible at the pace that we need it. We just saw it in 3 months. So my test to all of you, business leaders, policy leaders, etc., is don't come back and say that we cannot transform. But what we need to do is transform by design, not by disaster. And that's the key. So as we move forward, we need to ensure that we look at water across all the systems. We need to ensure that we bring in the transformational change that's possible through the technology that Ecolab has and others in order to optimize, but also to get back to the essential, which is around consumption. And that brings me back to limits to growth. The fact of the matter is that we continuously overconsume everything. COVID has reminded us what's important in our lives. Let's remember that resources are very important and are essential to our lives, and therefore we must preserve them and decrease our impact as well as our consumption of these vital resources, including water. So I'll close at that. 3 minutes late, apologies. I hope those of you who are on, and I have no clue how many people joined us, you enjoyed this conversation, and I wish you all well, stay healthy, and remember to preserve water.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandrine.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.